Hello and welcome to this, the fifth program in the series, Barbados' Sea Portal. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, thanks for your time. In last week's program, we began a look at the initial work that had to be done before the construction of the Deepwater Harbour. We were told of the fundamental roles of drivers like Leroy Robinson who worked on the Costian trucks. We discussed the suction dredger and how it pressed ahead with the work of extracting sediment from the seabed and the reclamation of land, certainly a novelty for Barbados. Today's program is built on last week's as we continue our look towards the actual construction.
Before all that could be done, we all had to take soundings to find the depth so that you could calculate the volume of material that was dredged out and put in, and also where the ships were going to come in. You had to make sure that it was deep enough that you wouldn't have a ship running aground. So we all had to sit down in a boat and have a chain over the end and measuring the depth. And you had somebody at a tide gauge reading the gauge, although it's only the tides are only about, at the worst, about 2.5, maybe 3 feet of the spring tide, but it makes a difference. So you had somebody reading a tide gauge all the time and knowing the time, and then you were out there in a boat. You had to we had a long, like 2,000-foot cable and a winch in the back of a boat, and that was tagged at every 20 feet. So you went along, every 20 feet you dropped the chain down and read the depth, and so you could calculate the amount of material that you were filling it back with. I mean, you had to have something to protect the ships, so you had to have that breakwater out there so that in the harbour itself the water would remain calm. And the only time you ever got anything in there is if you got waves coming up from the north, which might make it a bit rough in there, but normally the sea comes from this way, so that you don't get any waves in the harbour itself.
That breakwater, was set up for control the pounding of the waves, and they were able to work more comfortably in the enclosed area after they formed the road.
Well, the first thing I had to do is build a foundation, which involved bringing stone from Bagatelle. It was loaded onto barges with a drop bottom, and you had to bring the barge out, position it in the right spot before you open the doors, so that the plan is like basically building a rubble bank along the seabed, and then you had divers go down, and then you brought in smaller stone, as far down as like what you would use in concrete, and drop that in, and then the divers leveled it off. You put, just as though you would like doing a concrete floor, you would put down a rail that you can screed it off of. So the divers went down and did all that. But all those rails had to be lined up to make sure you were going the right direction. And then the blocks were placed on top of that when it was all nice and level and smooth and whatnot. And the blocks were then placed on top of that.
We used to put with the big stone, the small gravel, and the divers go down, and the crane used to drop those blocks. Those blocks made with a slope that's fitting one that from the bottom of the sea come right up. We had something called the stalk. Those men used to work with dredge.
Now these divers started very early in the morning, maybe 5:30 thereabout, and they work in a shift. At a certain time they would come out and another crew would go. The divers And the rest of the expatriates, actually, those who were married, lived in suitable quarters. But the others who were single lived in one assembly, mostly between the garrison.
Where I live, interestingly enough, the house that I live in was actually built by Costain for their engineers who were associated with the project. So I have that minor little relationship. I don't know how interesting it is, probably boring for everybody, but I do have that sort of association. Yeah.
There were 2 vehicles for transporting these. The drivers worked also on a shift because they had to bring them down to work early in the morning. Then the early afternoon one would change and another one would take over, and the night they will be carrying them back.
We had about 700 men in all. We used to work 24 hours a day. And my job was a linesman. In those days I used to do I was a part-time keeping. Because the time keeping, Johnny started to work at 7 o'clock. And sometimes I got to work at 5 or 24. I take the time, to take off the numbers of the men. So I was in charge of a diving storeroom. See? Because I used to work like Mr. Leo Picout was also a diver. So he used to inspect the work. And those blocks, all the brick wall. My job sometimes was to change some of those numbers so the divers could work. I used to go at night with a stencil and change dates. But they have to be careful for a certain amount of time before the divers,
When here was doing, they had a big tall plant up in the air, used to call it Ibasa plant. That used to mix concrete and everything, where it used to be transported from some train lines and taken down.
The batching plant, well known to Barbadians as the block-making machine, was situated in the vicinity of the bus terminus just off Cheapside Road. For many months it was busy grinding and producing all of the concrete that went into the blocks that made the brick wall. Shortly after the batching machine went into operation, hundreds of blocks were stockpiled in the block yard. Before the rubble bank to Pelican Island was completed, workers were busy laying the railway line on which the blocks were conveyed.
The blocks were molded by the same Costain. The stuff material brought from the quarry, it was crushed, and they had a unit set up much like what you find at the cement plant. And you have these little baskets rolling up to the top and down, and they use the material to form these large blocks which they use for constructing the harbour. They had a track, like a train line, set up between that plant and where they stocked these blocks. And they had a crane, I think there were 2 of them.
So I had 2 cranes up there. There was a lever crane that used to work at the dockyard, and then we had another lever crane that used to lay the blocks.
There were German cranes called Leber. And the person in charge of that, a German, his name was Wolfgang Seller. So these blocks were put in a certain point where they were collected by another crane and loaded and taken down to the bottom near Pelican. The divers would go down and see that they were locked in position.
One of the more challenging jobs during the construction of the Deepwater Harbour was the work of the divers who were employed to assist with the placement of the underwater foundation and with the laying of the blocks for the brick wall. Whenever diving was to be done, repellent was used to keep the sharks at bay, and there were workers responsible for suiting up the divers for their task.
He put on his woolies first, long woolen pants, long woolen shirt, put on his sights, his socks, and then he put on his boots, heavy boots, like lead boots, Then he have on his suit. So then he put on his boots, then he would walk to the ladder to take him down, because we worked on the pontoon in the sea that was anchored off with 4 sides to keep the pontoon stable. So we worked from that pontoon. And the diver, then he would back to the ladder where he goes down. We put on the helmet. And when they finished put on the helmet, I give him a little tap on his head, everything's okay. and he would go down and start working.
So the diver is down in the water. So the crane will lift the blocks off the, we had a carry, something that carries the blocks to the crane.
But then we had trains that would bring the blocks from the block yard down to the site to lay the blocks, you know. The divers do all that work.
You will drop the blocks in the water, and the crane will lift the block. That time the diver is underneath the water, he's working. And you have the linesman and a pikeman.
I worked as a pikeman, seeing after the air part for the diver. And then there was the linesman. He would take the signals from the diver and send them through to the crane man, the man driving the crane. That's how you want the blocks positioned.
And the diver is down, and he would position the blocks where he wanted it. But he would give you a signal on the rope. What they say, a linesman and a pikeman. The linesman, he carries the rope, and the pikeman with the air. Because we had a big air compressor pontoon, and that goes down. And so if the diver wanted to slow to the right or the left, he won't come up and tell you. He give you a signal on the rope. So when he give you a signal, you know what he mean to do, and you direct the crane man to sew the block in position. So that time you get back the diver the signal, and he tell you it's okay, and if he want it low, he give you a signal to low, and you would tell the crane man to low. Then when he wanted to stop, he pull the rope, and you would stop the man at the same time, and he stop it. If he wanted to slow to the left, to the right, go further back, you know, he give you the signal on the rope. Sometimes they used to have to wedge those blocks, because if they maybe an inch out, and we used to use green hair, packing on the bottom. He carried on the green hair packing, and he put it down to the level he wanted it, you know, and then the next block will come in fitting, and fitting like that.
The blocks had in their grooves, and they would slide into the grooves and fit neat inside there. They would start from the J block and come through to the A block, come through the alphabet, you know, and build the wall like that all the way across. So it's sure that the foundation was level. The A block, when it get up, it would be under the surface, you know, to sure the foundation was done correctly and level.
You put, just as though you would, like doing a concrete floor, you would put down a rail that you can screed it off of. So the divers went down and did all that. But all those rails had to be lined up to make sure you were going in the right direction. And then the blocks were placed on top of that when it was all nice and level and smooth and whatnot.
We also had the RE. He had his engineers, and the divers would go there. Their divers would go down, check and cost 10 divers, making sure that they did the work properly. And the RE, or he said the resident engineer, he would go down and check for himself. You know, besides his diver, he would check for himself and see everything's all right, because they work with the government to see that everything was done properly.
They acted on behalf of government to see that, or what Costains was doing was correct, to make sure that because they had, during the time, a lot of divers, people who were employed to go down during the construction of the harbor to dive into the thing and make sure that there were big, huge blocks that were being used, and make sure that they were connected properly.
We spend 2 hours and 2 hours. He's getting air from the helmet. The air pipe is connected to a compressor, and that's giving him air all the time. You may wait an hour or two. If you get tired, you know, you come and get a tea break. Because I know there was the Englishmen, and they love the tea. So when he's ready for tea, send through the signal to the linesman, and everyone put up the flag, and the man is driving the boat will see the flag up and know the diver ready for his tea. And you bring the tea for him. When the tea arrives, we give him a signal and tell the tea is here. By the line, you know, you give the linesman the signal, and you come and get his tea and get a smoke.
I know the blocks at the wall, the main breakwater and the quay wall, there was over 23,000 of them cast. And we used to cast, I can't even remember how many a day you did. But it was all, you know, you had forms that, steel forms that you could break apart from the previous day's casting and lift them with the crane and put them down and quickly reassemble them again. And they varied in weight from, some of them were as high as, well, about 20 tons, I believe, but the majority of them are around 8 or 10 tons each block. The whole thing was designed in such a way, because obviously you're building it on a rubble bank. Obviously it's going to settle. And the whole thing was designed in such a way that it was done in slices. All the blocks were in various slices, so that each slice could settle on its own without interfering with the others. And by the time then as all of that came along, and a crane had to sit on top of all that, so the weight, and if you go along on the outside of the breakwater now, you can see in places where it's really settled quite a lot. And then by the time as you came to put the final superstructure on, which brought it up, because the top of the blocks were only coming up to about water level. And then you had to put on the 10 or 12 foot of concrete on top, which was then, that was done like every 3 slices together. And as I say, if you go along on the outside, you can see where the blocks settled before that final thing went on. And now there's been no more settlement. Everything is settled down, and even when I had the earthquake here a year or two ago, it didn't seem to affect anything.
You would recall that it was on Thursday, November the 29th, 2007, that Barbados experienced a nerve-wracking tremor. While some buildings on the island were damaged, no sign of damage was visible on the brick wall. To construct the harbour, a concrete brick wall was laid out to sea on a rubble mattress. This took the form of an arm slightly bent at the elbow, the first part or inner arm running northwest for 980 feet, and the second half or outer arm running north for 1700 feet. This carried a roadway 28 feet wide and 10 feet above sea level, protected on the Carlisle Bay side by a massive wall extended 8 feet above road level. At the same time, the seabed on the landward side of the breakwater was dredged to a maximum depth of 32 feet, and the coral and sand mixture raised by dredger was pumped ashore to form the reclaimed area, all 10 feet above low water level. The water enclosed between this reclaimed land and the breakwater then formed a fine artificial harbour with berth for 8 modern ships at that time. The westward edge of the new land was bounded by a quay wall 1,200 feet long, which was the main berth for freighters. This in turn was joined to the root of the breakwater by a 500-foot berth constructed on concrete pier intended to serve the smaller inter-island motor vessels. A surface trench runs the whole length of the quay wall along the inside of the inner berth and right along the brick wall to the round head at the end, and from this vessels can be supplied with any type of fuel, oil and fresh water. On Saturday, July 23, 1960, Premier of Barbados Dr. Hugh Gordon Cummins laid the 22,949th block in the round head of the deep water harbour's brick wall. It was the final block. On that occasion, the Premier said,
"When the harbour goes into operation, then we will have a certain amount of headache. I'm speaking of labour, which will be dislocated as a result of the operation of this harbour. Already we are trying certain fields of endeavour. We hope when the time comes we will be able to say to the men, we've got this for you."
On that Saturday afternoon, the sea was choppy and the Premier, like others, got his feet wet. Photographers had to remove their shoes. The block was held aloft by the lifting gear of a large crane, and the Premier directed it into the correct position, assisted by Alan Peacock and Frank Derman.
all very interested in how it was done, and people here had never seen anything like that before. I must admit, I myself had from learning, doing a course, doing civil engineering in England, and there I'd seen big things being done, but people in Barbados had no idea of what was involved or how it was going to be done. And I remember saying to a fellow one night, when he said to me, "You think you can build that? You see, he's going to knock down that wall as fast as you put it up." And I said to him, "Well, you know, how wide do you think that wall is going to be?" I said, "It's going to be wider than this house that we are standing in." And he looked at me in absolute amazement. He must have thought we were going to build a 9-inch brick wall or something to think so.
Many could not possibly understand how a wall could be built in the sea, but our men did it successfully, and that wall remains in position like a mighty fortress, providing a safe harbor to ocean-going vessels that make use of this Barbados's seaporto. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. That brings us to the end of this week's program. Here is a special invitation for you to join me again next week at the same time as we continue our look towards the construction of a deep water harbor for Barbados on this Barbados's seaporto. It's goodbye for now.